Chapter 22. Do it to a finish. Years ago, a relief lifeboat at New London sprung a leak, and while being repaired, a hammer was found in the bottom that had been left there by the builders 13 years before. From the constant motion of the boat, the hammer had worn through the planking, clear down to the plating. Not long since, it was discovered that a girl had served 20 years for a 20-month sentence in a southern prison, because of the mistake of a court clerk who wrote years instead of months in the record of the prisoner's sentence. The history of the human race is full of the most horrible tragedies caused by carelessness and the inexcusable blunders of those who never formed the habit of accuracy, of thoroughness, of doing things to a finish. Multitudes of people have lost an eye, a leg, or an arm, or are otherwise maimed, because dishonest workmen wrought deception into the articles they manufactured, slighted their work, covered up defects and weak places with paint and varnish. How many have lost their lives because of dishonest work, carelessness, criminal blundering in railroad construction? Think of the tragedies caused by lies packed in car wheels, locomotives, steamboat boilers, and engines, lies in defective rails, ties, or switches, lies in dishonest labor put into manufactured material by workmen who said it was good enough for the meager wages they got. Because people were not conscientious in their work, there were flaws in the steel, which caused the rail or pillar to snap, the locomotive or other machinery to break. The steel shaft broke in mid-ocean, and the lives of 1,000 passengers were jeopardized because of somebody's carelessness. Even before they are completed, buildings often fall and bury the workmen under their ruins, because somebody was careless, dishonest, either employer or employee, and worked lies, deceptions, into the building. The majority of railroad wrecks, of disasters on land and sea, which cause so much misery and cost so many lives, are the result of carelessness, thoughtlessness, or half-done, botched, blundering work. They are the evil fruit of the low ideals of slovenly, careless, indifferent workers. Everywhere over this broad earth we see the tragic results of botched work. Wooden legs, armless sleeves, numberless graves, fatherless and motherless homes everywhere speak of somebody's carelessness, somebody's blunders, somebody's habit of inaccuracy. The worst crimes are not punishable by law. Carelessness, slipshodness, lack of thoroughness, are crimes against self, against humanity, that often do more harm than the crimes that make the perpetrator an outcast from society. Where a tiny flaw or the slightest defect may cost a precious life, carelessness is as much a crime as deliberate criminality. If everybody put his conscience into his work, did it to a complete finish, it would not only reduce the loss of human life, the mangling and maiming of men and women, to a fraction of what it is at present, but it would also give us a higher quality of manhood and womanhood. Most young people think too much of quantity, and too little of quality in their work. They try to do too much, and do not do it well. They do not realize that the education, the comfort, the satisfaction, the general improvement, and bracing up of the whole man that comes from doing one thing absolutely right, from putting the trademark of one's character on it, far outweighs the value that attaches to the doing of 1,000 botched or slipshod jobs. We are so constituted that the quality which we put into our life work affects everything else in our lives, and tends to bring our whole conduct to the same level. The entire person takes on the characteristics of one's usual way of doing things. The habit of precision and accuracy strengthens the mentality, improves the whole character. On the contrary, doing things in a loose-jointed, slipshod, careless manner deteriorates the whole mentality, demoralizes the mental processes, and pulls down the whole life. Every half-done or slovenly job that goes out of your hands leaves its trace of demoralization behind. After slighting your work, after doing a poor job, you are not quite the same man you were before. You are not so likely to try to keep up the standard of your work, not so likely to regard your word as sacred as before. The mental and moral effect of half-doing, or carelessly doing things, its power to drag down, to demoralize, can hardly be estimated because the processes are so gradual, so subtle. No one can respect himself who habitually botches his work, and when self-respect drops, confidence goes with it, and when confidence and self-respect have gone, excellence is impossible. It is astonishing how completely a slovenly habit will gradually, insidiously fasten itself upon the individual and so change his whole mental attitude as to thwart absolutely his life purpose, even when he may think he is doing his best to carry it out. I know a man who was extremely ambitious to do something very distinctive and who had the ability to do it. When he started on his career, he was very exact and painstaking. He demanded the best of himself, would not accept his second best in anything. The thought of slighting his work was painful to him, but his mental processes have so deteriorated, and he has become so demoralized by the habit which, after a while, grew upon him, of accepting his second best, that he now slights his work without a protest, seemingly without being conscious of it. He is today doing quite ordinary things, without apparent mortification or sense of humiliation, and the tragedy of it all is, he does not know why he has failed. One's ambition and ideals need constant watching and cultivation in order to keep up to the standards. Many people are so constituted that their ambition wanes and their ideals drop when they are alone, or with careless, indifferent people. They require the constant assistance, suggestion, prodding, or example of others to keep them up to standard. How quickly a youth of high ideals, who has been well trained in thoroughness, often deteriorates when he leaves home and goes to work for an employer with inferior ideals and slipshod methods. The introduction of inferiority into our work is like introducing subtle poison into the system. It paralyzes the normal functions. Inferiority is an infection which, like leaven, affects the entire system. It dulls ideals, palsies the aspiring faculty, stupefies the ambition, and causes deterioration all along the line. The human mechanism is so constituted that whatever goes wrong in one part affects the whole structure. There is a very intimate relation between the quality of the work and the quality of the character. Did you ever notice the rapid decline in a young man's character when he began to slight his work, to shirk, to slip in rotten hours, rotten service? If you should ask the inmates of our penitentiaries what had caused their ruin, many of them could trace the first signs of deterioration to shirking, clipping their hours, deceiving their employers, to indifferent, dishonest work. We were made to be honest. Honesty is our normal expression, and any departure from it demoralizes and taints the whole character. Honesty means integrity in everything. It not only means reliability in your word, but also carefulness, accuracy, honesty in your work. It does not mean that if only you will not lie with your lips you may lie and defraud in the quality of your work. Honesty means wholeness, completeness, it means truth in everything, in deed and in word. Merely not to steal another's money or goods is not all there is to honesty. You must not steal another's time, you must not steal his goods or ruin his property by half finishing or botching your work, by blundering through carelessness or indifference. Your contract with your employer means that you will give him your best, and not your second best. "What a fool you are," said one workman to another, "to take so much pains with that job, when you don't get much pay for it. Get the most money for the least work, is my rule, and I get twice as much money as you do." "That may be," replied the other, "but I shall like myself better, I shall think more of myself, and that is more important to me than money." You will like yourself better when you have the approval of your conscience. That will be worth more to you than any amount of money you can pocket through fraudulent, skimped, or botched work. Nothing else can give you the glow of satisfaction, the electric thrill and uplift which come from a superbly done job. Perfect work harmonizes with the very principles of our being, because we were made for perfection. It fits our very natures. Someone has said, it is a race between negligence and ignorance as to which can make the more trouble. Many a young man is being kept down by what probably seems a small thing to him: negligence, lack of accuracy. He never quite finishes anything he undertakes, he cannot be depended upon to do anything quite right, his work always needs looking over by someone else. Hundreds of clerks and bookkeepers are getting small salaries in poor positions today because they have never learned to do things absolutely right. A prominent businessman says that the carelessness, inaccuracy, and blundering of employees cost Chicago $1 million a day. The manager of a large house in that city says that he has to station pickets here and there throughout the establishment in order to neutralize the evils of inaccuracy and the blundering habit. One of John Wanamaker's partners says that unnecessary blunders and mistakes cost that firm $25,000 a year. The dead letter department of the post office in Washington received in 1 year 7 million pieces of undelivered mail. Of these, more than 80,000 bore no address whatever. A great many of them were from business houses. Are the clerks who are responsible for this carelessness likely to win promotion? Many an employee who would be shocked at the thought of telling his employer a lie with his lips is lying every day in the quality of his work, in his dishonest service, in the rotten hours he is slipping into it, in shirking, in his indifference to his employer's interests. It is just as dishonest to express deception in poor work, in shirking, as to express it with the lips, yet I have known office boys, who could not be induced to tell their employer a direct lie, to steal his time when on an errand, to hide away during working hours to smoke a cigarette or take a nap, not realizing, perhaps, that lies can be acted as well as told and that acting a lie may be even worse than telling one. The man who botches his work, who lies or cheats in the goods he sells or manufactures, is dishonest with himself as well as with his fellow men, and must pay the price in loss of self-respect, loss of character, of standing in his community. Yet on every side we see all sorts of things selling for a song because the maker put no character, no thought into them. Articles of clothing that look stylish and attractive when first worn, very quickly get out of shape, and hang and look like old, much-worn garments. Buttons fly off, seams give way at the slightest strain, dropped stitches are everywhere in evidence, and often the entire article goes to pieces before it is worn half a dozen times. Everywhere we see furniture which looks all right, but which in reality is full of blemishes and weaknesses, covered up with paint and varnish. Glue starts at joints, chairs and bedsteads break down at the slightest provocation, casters come off, handles pull out, many things go to pieces altogether, even while practically new. Made to sell, not for service, would be a good label for the great mass of manufactured articles in our markets today. It is difficult to find anything that is well and honestly made, that has character, individuality and thoroughness wrought into it. Most things are just thrown together. This slipshod, dishonest manufacturing is so general that concerns which turn out products based upon honesty and truth often win for themselves a worldwide reputation and command the highest prices. There is no other advertisement like a good reputation. Some of the world's greatest manufacturers have regarded their reputation as their most precious possession, and under no circumstances would they allow their names to be put on an imperfect article. Vast sums of money are often paid for the use of a name, because of its great reputation for integrity and square dealing. There was a time when the names of Graham and Tampion on timepieces were guarantees of the most exquisite workmanship and of unquestioned integrity. Strangers from any part of the world could send their purchase money and order goods from those manufacturers without a doubt that they would be squarely dealt with. Tampion and Graham lie in Westminster Abbey because of the accuracy of their work, because they refuse to manufacture and sell lies. When you finish a thing you ought to be able to say to yourself, "There, I am willing to stand for that piece of work. It is not pretty well done, it is done as well as I can do it, done to a complete finish. I will stand for that. I am willing to be judged by it." Never be satisfied with fairly good, pretty good, good enough. Accept nothing short of your best. Put such a quality into your work that anyone who comes across anything you have ever done will see character in it, individuality in it, your trademark of superiority upon it. Your reputation is at stake in everything you do, and your reputation is your capital. You cannot afford to do a poor job, to let botched work or anything that is inferior go out of your hands. Every bit of your work, no matter how unimportant or trivial it may seem, should bear your trademark of excellence. You should regard every task that goes through your hands, every piece of work you touch, as Tampion regarded every watch that went out of his shop. It must be the very best you can do, the best that human skill can produce. It is just the little difference between the good and the best that makes the difference between the artist and the artisan. It is just the little touches after the average man would quit that make the master's fame. Regard your work as Stradivarius regarded his violins, which he made for eternity, and not one of which was ever known to come to pieces or break. Stradivarius did not need any patent on his violins, for no other violin maker would pay such a price for excellence as he paid, would take such pains to put his stamp of superiority upon his instrument. Every Stradivarius now in existence is worth from $3,000 to $10,000, or several times its weight in gold. Think of the value such a reputation for thoroughness as that of Stradivarius or Tampion, such a passion to give quality to your work, would give you. There is nothing like being enamored of accuracy, being grounded in thoroughness as a life principle, of always striving for excellence. No other characteristic makes such a strong impression upon an employer as the habit of painstaking, carefulness, accuracy. He knows that if a youth puts his conscience into his work from principle, not from the standpoint of salary or what he can get for it, but because there is something in him which refuses to accept anything from himself but the best, that he is honest and made of good material. I have known many instances where advancement hinged upon the little overplus of interest, of painstaking an employee put into his work, on his doing a little better than was expected of him. Employers do not say all they think, but they detect very quickly the earmarks of superiority. They keep their eye on the employee who has the stamp of excellence upon him, who takes pains with his work, who does it to a finish. They know he has a future. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., says that the secret of success is to do the common duty uncommonly well. The majority of young people do not see that the steps which lead to the position above them are constructed, little by the faithful performance of the common, humble, everyday duties of the position they are now filling. The thing which you are now doing will unlock or bar the door to promotion. Many employees are looking for some great thing to happen that will give them an opportunity to show their mettle. What can there be, they say to themselves, in this dry routine, in doing these common, ordinary things, to help me along? But it is the youth who sees a great opportunity hidden in just these simple services, who sees a very uncommon chance in a common situation, a humble position, who gets on in the world. It is doing things a little better than those about you do them, being a little neater, a little quicker, a little more accurate, a little more observant. It is ingenuity in finding new and more progressive ways of doing old things. It is being a little more polite, a little more obliging, a little more tactful, a little more cheerful, optimistic, a little more energetic, helpful, than those about you that attracts the attention of your employer and other employers also. Many a boy is marked for a higher position by his employer long before he is aware of it himself. It may be months, or it may be a year before the opening comes, but when it does come, the one who has appreciated the infinite difference between good and better, between fairly good and excellent, between what others call good and the best that can be done, will be likely to get the place. If there is that in your nature which demands the best and will take nothing less, if you insist on keeping up your standards in everything you do, you will achieve distinction in some line provided you have the persistence and determination to follow your ideal. But if you are satisfied with the cheap and shoddy, the botched and slovenly, if you are not particular about quality in your work, or in your environment, or in your personal habits, then you must expect to take second place, to fall back to the rear of the procession. People who have accomplished work worthwhile have had a very high sense of the way to do things. They have not been content with mediocrity. They have not confined themselves to the beaten tracks. They have never been satisfied to do things just as others do them, but always a little better. They always pushed things that came to their hands a little higher up, a little farther on. It is this little higher up, this little farther on, that counts in the quality of life's work. It is the constant effort to be first class in everything one attempts that conquers the heights of excellence. It is said that Daniel Webster made the best chowder in his state on the principle that he would not be second class in anything. This is a good resolution with which to start out in your career, never to be second class in anything. No matter what you do, try to do it as well as it can be done. Have nothing to do with the inferior. Do your best in everything, deal with the best, choose the best, live up to your best. Everywhere we see mediocre or second-class men, perpetual clerks who will never get away from the yardstick, mechanics who will never be anything but bunglers, all sorts of people who will never rise above mediocrity, who will always fill very ordinary positions because they do not take pains, do not put conscience into their work, do not try to be first class. Aside from the lack of desire or effort to be first class, there are other things that help to make second-class men. Dissipation, bad habits, neglect of health, failure to get an education, all make second-class men. A man weakened by dissipation, whose understanding has been dulled, whose growth has been stunted by self-indulgences, is a second-class man, if, indeed, he is not third-class. A man who, through his amusements in his hours of leisure, exhausts his strength and vitality, vitiates his blood, wears his nerves till his limbs tremble like leaves in the wind, is only half a man, and could in no sense be called first class. Everybody knows the things that make for second-class characteristics. Boys imitate older boys and smoke cigarettes in order to be smart. Then they keep on smoking because they have created an appetite as unnatural as it is harmful. Men get drunk for all sorts of reasons, but, whatever the reason, they cannot remain first-class men and drink. Dissipation in other forms is pursued because of pleasure to be derived, but the surest consequence is that of becoming second-class, below the standard of the best men for any purpose. Every fault you allow to become a habit, to get control over you, helps to make you second-class, and puts you at a disadvantage in the race for honor, position, wealth, and happiness. Carelessness as to health fills the ranks of the inferior. The submerged classes that the economists talk about are those that are below the high water mark of the best manhood and womanhood. Sometimes they are second-rate or third-rate people because those who are responsible for their being and their care during their minor years were so before them, but more and more is it becoming one's own fault if, all through life, he remains second-class. Education of some sort, and even a pretty good sort, is possible to practically everyone in our land. Failure to get the best education available, whether it be in books or in business training, is sure to relegate one to the ranks of the second class. There is no excuse for incompetence in this age of opportunity, no excuse for being second class when it is possible to be first class, and when first class is in demand everywhere. Second class things are wanted only when first class can't be had. You wear first class clothes if you can pay for them, eat first class butter, first-class meat, and first-class bread, or, if you don't, you wish you could. Second-class men are no more wanted than any other second-class commodity. They are taken and used when the better article is scarce or is too high-priced for the occasion. For work that really amounts to anything, first-class men are wanted. If you make yourself first-class in anything, no matter what your condition or circumstances, no matter what your race or color, you will be in demand. If you are a king in your calling, no matter how humble it may be, nothing can keep you from success. The world does not demand that you be a physician, a lawyer, a farmer, or a merchant, but it does demand that whatever you do undertake, you will do it right, will do it with all your might and with all the ability you possess. It demands that you be a master in your line. When Daniel Webster, who had the best brain of his time, was asked to make a speech on some question at the close of a congressional session, he replied, "I never allow myself to speak on any subject until I have made it my own. I haven't time to do that in this case, hence, I must refuse to speak on the subject." Dickens would never consent to read before an audience until he had thoroughly prepared his selection. Balzac, the great French novelist, sometimes worked a week on a single page. Macready, when playing before scant audiences in country theatres in England, Ireland, and Scotland, always played as if he were before the most brilliant audiences in the great metropolises of the world. Thoroughness characterizes all successful men. Genius is the art of taking infinite pains. The trouble with many Americans is that they seem to think they can put any sort of poor, slipshod, half-done work into their careers and get first-class products. They do not realize that all great achievement has been characterized by extreme care, infinite painstaking, even to the minutest detail. No youth can ever hope to accomplish much who does not have thoroughness and accuracy indelibly fixed in his life habit. Slipshodness, inaccuracy, the habit of half-doing things, would ruin the career of a youth with a Napoleon's mind. If we were to examine a list of the men who have left their mark on the world, we should find that, as a rule, it is not composed of those who were brilliant in youth, or who gave great promise at the outset of their careers, but rather of the plodding young men who, if they have not dazzled by their brilliancy, have had the power of a day's work in them, who could stay by a task until it was done, and well done, who have had grit, persistence, common sense, and honesty. The thorough boys are the boys that are heard from, and usually from posts far higher up than those filled by the boys who were too smart to be thorough. One such boy is Elihu Root, now United States Senator. When he was a boy in the grammar school at Clinton, New York, he made up his mind that anything he had to study he would keep at until he mastered it. Although not considered one of the bright boys of the school, his teachers soon found that when Elihu professed to know anything he knew it through and through. He was fond of hard problems requiring application and patience. Sometimes the other boys called him a plodder, but Elihu would only smile pleasantly, for he knew what he was about. On winter evenings, while the other boys were out skating, Elihu frequently remained in his room with his arithmetic or algebra. Mr. Root recently said that if his close application to problems in his boyhood did nothing else for him, it made him careful about jumping at conclusions. To every problem there was only one answer, and patience was the price to be paid for it. Carrying the principle of doing everything to a finish into the law, he became one of the most noted members of the New York bar, entrusted with vast interests, and then a member of the president's cabinet. William Ellery Channing, the great New England divine, who in his youth was hardly able to buy the clothes he needed, had a passion for self-improvement. "I wanted to make the most of myself," he says. "I was not satisfied with knowing things superficially and by halves, but tried to get comprehensive views of what I studied." The quality which, more than any other, has helped to raise the German people to their present commanding position in the world, is their thoroughness. It is giving young Germans a great advantage over both English and American youths. Every employer is looking for thoroughness, and German employees, owing to their preeminence in this respect, the superiority of their training, and the completeness of their preparation for business, are in great demand today in England, especially in banks and large mercantile houses. As a rule, a German who expects to engage in business takes a 4 years course in some commercial school, and after graduation serves 3 years apprenticeship without pay, to his chosen business. Thoroughness and reliability, the Germans' characteristics, are increasing the power of Germany throughout the civilized world. Our great lack is want of thoroughness. How seldom you find a young man or woman who is willing to prepare for his life work. A little education is all they want, a little smattering of books, and then they are ready for business. "Can't wait, haven't time to be thorough," is characteristic of our country, and is written on everything: on commerce, on schools, on society, on churches. We can't wait for a high school, seminary, or college education. The boy can't wait to become a youth, nor the youth to become a man. Young men rush into business with no great reserve of education or drill. Of course, they do poor, feverish work, and break down in middle life, while many die of old age in the 40s. Perhaps there is no other country in the world where so much poor work is done as in America. Half-trained medical students perform bungling operations, and butcher their patients, because they are not willing to take time for thorough preparation. Half-trained lawyers stumble through their cases, and make their clients pay for experience which the law school should have given. Half-trained clergymen bungle away in the pulpit, and disgust their intelligent and cultured parishioners. Many an American youth is willing to stumble through life half prepared for his work, and then blame society because he is a failure. A young man, armed with letters of introduction from prominent men, one day presented himself before Chief Engineer Parsons of the Rapid Transit Commission of New York as a candidate for a position. "What can you do? Have you any specialty?" asked Mr. Parsons. "I can do almost anything," answered the young man. "Well," remarked the chief engineer, rising to end the interview, "I have no use for anyone who can almost do anything. I prefer someone who can actually do one thing thoroughly." There is a great crowd of human beings just outside the door of proficiency. They can half do a great many things, but can't do any one thing well, to a finish. They have acquisitions which remain permanently unavailable because they were not carried quite to the point of skill. They stopped just short of efficiency. How many people almost know a language or two, which they can neither write nor speak, a science or two, whose elements they have not fully mastered, an art or two, which they cannot practice with satisfaction or profit. The Patent Office at Washington contains hundreds, yes, thousands, of inventions which are useless simply because they are not quite practical, because the men who started them lack the staying quality, the education, or the ability necessary to carry them to the point of practicability. The world is full of half-finished work, failures which require only a little more persistence, a little finer mechanical training, a little better education, to make them useful to civilization. Think what a loss it would be if such men as Edison and Bell had not come to the front and carried to a successful termination the half-finished work of others. Make it a life rule to give your best to whatever passes through your hands. Stamp it with your manhood. Let superiority be your trademark, let it characterize everything you touch. This is what every employer is looking for. It indicates the best kind of brain, it is the best substitute for genius, it is better capital than cash, it is a better promoter than friends, or pulls with the influential. A successful manufacturer says, if you make a good pin, you will earn more money than if you make a bad steam engine. If a man can write a better book, preach a better sermon, or make a better mousetrap than his neighbor, says Emerson, though he build his house in the woods, the world will make a path to his door. Never allow yourself to dwell too much upon what you are getting for your work. You have something of infinitely greater importance, greater value, at stake. Your honor, your whole career, your future success, will be affected by the way you do your work, by the conscience or lack of it which you put into your job. Character, manhood and womanhood are at stake, compared with which salary is nothing. Everything you do is a part of your career. If any work that goes out of your hands is skimped, shirked, bungled, or botched, your character will suffer. If your work is badly done, if it goes to pieces, if there is shoddy or sham in it, if there is dishonesty in it, there is shoddy, sham, dishonesty in your character. We are all of a piece. We cannot have an honest character, a complete, untarnished career, when we are constantly slipping rotten hours, defective material and slipshod service into our work. The man who has dealt in shams and inferiority, who has botched his work all his life, must be conscious that he has not been a real man. He cannot help feeling that his career has been a botched one. To spend a life buying and selling lies, dealing in cheap, shoddy shams, or botching one's work, is demoralizing to every element of nobility. Beecher said he was never again quite the same man after reading Ruskin. You are never again quite the same man after doing a poor job, after botching your work. You cannot be just to yourself and unjust to the man you are working for in the quality of your work, for, if you slight your work, you not only strike a fatal blow at your efficiency, but also smirch your character. If you would be a full man, a complete man, a just man, you must be honest to the core in the quality of your work. No one can be really happy who does not believe in his own honesty. We are so constituted that every departure from the right, from principle, causes loss of self-respect, and makes us unhappy. Every time we obey the inward law of doing right we hear an inward approval, the amen of the soul, and every time we disobey it, a protest or condemnation. There is everything in holding a high ideal of your work, for whatever model the mind holds, the life copies. Whatever your vocation, let quality be your life slogan. A famous artist said he would never allow himself to look at an inferior drawing or painting, to do anything that was low or demoralizing, lest familiarity with it should taint his own ideal and thus be communicated to his brush. Many excuse poor, slipshod work on the plea of lack of time. But in the ordinary situations of life there is plenty of time to do everything as it ought to be done. There is an indescribable superiority added to the character and fiber of the man who always and everywhere puts quality into his work. There is a sense of wholeness, of satisfaction, of happiness, in his life which is never felt by the man who does not do his level best every time. He is not haunted by the ghosts or tail ends of half-finished tasks, of skipped problems, is not kept awake by a troubled conscience. When we are trying with all our might to do our level best, our whole nature improves. Everything looks down when we are going downhill. Aspiration lifts the life, groveling lowers it. Don't think you will never hear from a half-finished job, a neglected or botched piece of work. It will never die. It will bob up farther along in your career at the most unexpected moments, in the most embarrassing situations. It will be sure to mortify you when you least expect it. Like Banquo's ghost, it will arise at the most unexpected moments to mar your happiness. A single broken thread in a web of cloth is traced back to the girl who neglected her work in the factory, and the amount of damage is deducted from her wages. Thousands of people are held back all their lives and obliged to accept inferior positions because they cannot entirely overcome the handicap of slipshod habits formed early in life, habits of inaccuracy, of slovenliness, of skipping difficult problems in school, of slurring their work, shirking, or half doing it. "Oh, that's good enough, what's the use of being so awfully particular," has been the beginning of a lifelong handicap in many a career. I was much impressed by this motto, which I saw recently in a great establishment, where only the best is good enough. What a life motto this would be! How it would revolutionize civilization if everyone were to adopt it and use it, to resolve that, whatever they did only the best they could do would be good enough, would satisfy them. Adopt this motto as yours. Hang it up in your bedroom, in your office or place of business, put it into your pocketbook, weave it into the texture of everything you do, and your life work will be what everyone's should be, a masterpiece. Chapter 23. The Reward of Persistence. Every noble work is at first impossible. Carlyle. Victory belongs to the most persevering. Napoleon. Success in most things depends on knowing how long it takes to succeed. Montesquieu. Perpetual pushing and assurance put a difficulty out of countenance, and make a seeming impossibility give way. Jeremy Collier. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel. The nerve that never relaxes, the eye that never blanches, the thought that never wanders, these are the masters of victory. Burke. The pit rose at me, exclaimed Edmund Kean in a wild tumult of emotion, as he rushed home to his trembling wife. "Mary, you shall ride in your carriage yet, and Charles shall go to Eton." He had been so terribly in earnest with the study of his profession that he had at length made a mark on his generation. He was a little dark man with a voice naturally harsh, but he determined, when young, to play the character of Sir Giles Overreach, in Massinger's drama, as no other man had ever played it. By a persistency that nothing seemed able to daunt, he so trained himself to play the character that his success, when it did come, was overwhelming, and all London was at his feet. "I am sorry to say that I don't think this is in your line," said Woodfall the reporter, after Sheridan had made his first speech in Parliament. "You would better have stuck to your former pursuits." With head on his hand Sheridan mused for a time, then looked up and said, "It is in me, and it shall come out of me." From the same man came that harangue against Warren Hastings which the orator Fox called the best speech ever made in the House of Commons. "I had no other books than Heaven and Earth, which are open to all," said Bernard Palissy, who left his home in the south of France in 1828, at the age of 18. Though only a glass painter, he had the soul of an artist. The sight of an elegant Italian cup disturbed his whole existence, and from that moment the determination to discover the enamel with which it was glazed possessed him like a passion. For months and years he tried all kinds of experiments to learn the materials of which the enamel was compounded. He built a furnace, which was a failure, and then a second, burning so much wood, spoiling so many drugs and pots of common earthenware, and losing so much time, that poverty stared him in the face, and he was forced, from lack of ability to buy fuel, to try his experiments in a common furnace. Flat failure was the result, but he decided on the spot to begin all over again, and soon had 300 pieces baking, one of which came out covered with beautiful enamel. To perfect his invention he next built a glass furnace, carrying the bricks on his back. At length the time came for a trial, but, though he kept the heat up 6 days, his enamel would not melt. His money was all gone, but he borrowed some, and bought more pots and wood, and tried to get a better flux. When next he lighted his fire, he attained no result until his fuel was gone. Tearing off the palings of his garden fence, he fed them to the flames, but in vain. His furniture followed to no purpose. The shelves of his pantry were then broken up and thrown into the furnace, and the great burst of heat melted the enamel. The grand secret was learned. Persistence had triumphed again. If you work hard 2 weeks without selling a book, wrote a publisher to an agent, you will make a success of it. Know thy work and do it, said Carlyle, and work at it like a Hercules. Whoever is resolved to excel in painting, or, indeed, in any other art, said Reynolds, must bring all his mind to bear upon that one object from the moment that he rises till he goes to bed. I have no secret but hard work, said Turner, the painter. The man who is perpetually hesitating which of two things he will do first, said William Wirt, will do neither. The man who resolves, but suffers his resolution to be changed by the first counter-suggestion of a friend, who fluctuates from opinion to opinion, from plan to plan, and veers like a weathercock to every point of the compass, with every breath of caprice that blows, can never accomplish anything great or useful. Instead of being progressive in anything, he will be at best stationary, and, more probably, retrograde in all. Perseverance built the pyramids on Egypt's plains, erected the gorgeous temple at Jerusalem, enclosed in adamant the Chinese Empire, scaled the stormy, cloud-capped Alps, opened a highway through the watery wilderness of the Atlantic, leveled the forests of the New World, and reared in its stead a community of states and nations. Perseverance has wrought from the marble block the exquisite creations of genius, painted on canvas the gorgeous mimicry of nature, and engraved on a metallic surface the viewless substance of the shadow. Perseverance has put in motion millions of spindles, winged as many flying shuttles, harnessed thousands of iron steeds to as many freighted cars, and set them flying from town to town and nation to nation, tunneled mountains of granite, and annihilated space with the lightning's speed. It has whitened the waters of the world with the sails of 100 nations, navigated every sea and explored every land. It has reduced nature in her 1,000 forms to as many sciences, taught her laws, prophesied her future movements, measured her untrodden spaces, counted her myriad hosts of worlds, and computed their distances, dimensions, and velocities. The slow penny is surer than the quick dollar. The slow trotter will out-travel the fleet racer. Genius darts, flutters, and tires, but perseverance wears and wins. The all-day horse wins the race. The afternoon man wears off the laurels. The last blow drives home the nail. Are your discoveries often brilliant intuitions? Asked a reporter of Thomas A. Edison. Do they come to you while you are lying awake nights? I never did anything worth doing by accident, was the reply, nor did any of my inventions come indirectly through accident, except the phonograph. No, when I have fully decided that a result is worth getting, I go ahead on it and make trial after trial until it comes. I have always kept strictly within the lines of commercially useful inventions. I have never had any time to put on electrical wonders, valuable simply as novelties to catch the popular fancy. I like it, continued the great inventor. I don't know any other reason. Anything I have begun is always on my mind, and I am not easy while away from it until it is finished. A man who thus gives himself wholly to his work is certain to accomplish something, and if he have ability and common sense, his success will be great. How Bulwer wrestled with the fates to change his apparent destiny. His first novel was a failure, his early poems were failures, and his youthful speeches provoked the ridicule of his opponents. But he fought his way to eminence through ridicule and defeat. Gibbon worked 20 years on his decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Noah Webster spent 36 years on his dictionary. What a sublime patience he showed in devoting a life to the collection and definition of words. George Bancroft spent 26 years on his history of the United States. Newton rewrote his chronology of ancient nations 15 times. Titian wrote to Charles V, "I send your Majesty the Last Supper," after working on it almost daily for 7 years. He worked on his Pietro Martin 8 years. George Stephenson was 15 years perfecting his locomotive, Watt, 20 years on his condensing engine. Harvey labored 8 long years before he published his discovery of the circulation of the blood. He was then called a crack-brained impostor by his fellow physicians. Amid abuse and ridicule, he waited 25 years before his great discovery was recognized by the profession. Newton discovered the law of gravitation before he was 21, but one slight error in a measurement of the Earth's circumference interfered with a demonstration of the correctness of his theory. 20 years later he corrected the error, and showed that the planets roll in their orbits as a result of the same law which brings an apple to the ground. Southern, the great actor, said that the early part of his theatrical career was spent in getting dismissed for incompetency. "Never depend upon your genius," said John Ruskin, in the words of Joshua Reynolds, "if you have talent, industry will improve it, if you have none, industry will supply the deficiency." Savages believe that when they conquer an enemy, his spirit enters into them, and fights for them ever afterwards. So the spirit of our conquests enters us, and helps us to win the next victory. Blücher may have been routed at Ligny yesterday, but today you hear the thunder of his guns at Waterloo hurling dismay and death among his former conquerors. Opposing circumstances create strength. Opposition gives us greater power of resistance. To overcome one barrier gives us greater ability to overcome the next. In February 1492, a poor grey-haired man, his head bowed with discouragement almost to the back of his mule, rode slowly out through the beautiful gateway of the Alhambra. From boyhood he had been haunted with the idea that the earth is round. He believed that the piece of carved wood picked up 400 miles at sea and the bodies of 2 men unlike any other human beings known, found on the shores of Portugal, had drifted from unknown lands in the west. But his last hope of obtaining aid for a voyage of discovery had failed. King John of Portugal, while pretending to think of helping him, had sent out secretly an expedition of his own. He had begged bread, drawn maps, and charts to keep from starving. He had lost his wife, his friends had called him crazy, and forsaken him. The Council of Wise Men called by Ferdinand and Isabella ridiculed his theory of reaching the east by sailing west. "But the sun and moon are round," said Columbus, "why not the earth?" "If the earth is a ball, what holds it up?" asked the wise men. "What holds the sun and moon up?" inquired Columbus. "But how can men walk with their heads hanging down, and their feet up, like flies on a ceiling?" asked a learned doctor. "How can trees grow with their roots in the air?" "The water would run out of the ponds and we should fall off," said another philosopher. This doctrine is contrary to the Bible, which says, "The heavens are stretched out like a tent. Of course it is flat, it is rank heresy to say it is round," said a priest. Columbus left the Alhambra in despair, intending to offer his services to Charles VII, but he heard a voice calling his name. An old friend had told Isabella that it would add great renown to her reign at a trifling expense if what the sailor believed should prove true. "It shall be done," said Isabella, I will pledge my jewels to raise the money. Call him back. Columbus turned, and with him turned the world. Not a sailor would go voluntarily, so the king and queen compelled them. 3 days out, in his vessels scarcely larger than fishing schooners, the painter floated a signal of distress for a broken rudder. Terror seized the sailors, but Columbus calmed their fears with pictures of gold and precious stones from India. 200 miles west of the Canaries, the compass ceased to point to the North Star. The sailors are ready to mutiny, but he tells them the North Star is not exactly north. 2,300 miles from home, though he tells them it is but 1,700, a bush with berries floats by, land birds fly near, and they pick up a piece of wood curiously carved. On October 12, Columbus raised the banner of Castile over the Western world. "How hard I worked at that tremendous shorthand, and all improvement appertaining to it," said Dickens. "I will only add to what I have already written of my perseverance at this time of my life, and of a patient and continuous energy which then began to be matured." Cyrus W. Field had retired from business with a large fortune when he became possessed with the idea that by means of a cable laid upon the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, telegraphic communication could be established between Europe and America. He plunged into the undertaking with all the force of his being. The preliminary work included the construction of a telegraph line 1,000 miles long, from New York to St. John's, Newfoundland. Through 400 miles of almost unbroken forest they had to build a road as well as a telegraph line across Newfoundland. Another stretch of 140 miles across the island of Cape Breton involved a great deal of labor, as did the laying of a cable across the St. Lawrence. By hard work he secured aid for his company from the British government, but in Congress he encountered such bitter opposition from a powerful lobby that his measure only had a majority of 1 in the Senate. The cable was loaded upon the Agamemnon, the flagship of the British fleet at Sebastopol, and upon the Niagara, a magnificent new frigate of the United States Navy, but, when 5 miles of cable had been paid out, it caught in the machinery and parted. On the second trial, when 200 miles at sea, the electric current was suddenly lost, and men paced the decks nervously and sadly, as if in the presence of death. Just as Mr. Field was about to give the order to cut the cable, the current returned as quickly and mysteriously as it had disappeared. The following night, when the ship was moving but 4 miles an hour and the cable running out at the rate of 6 miles, the brakes were applied too suddenly just as the steamer gave a heavy lurch, breaking the cable. Field was not the man to give up. 700 miles more of cable were ordered, and a man of great skill was set to work to devise a better machine for paying out the long line. American and British inventors united in making a machine. At length in mid-ocean the 2 halves of the cable were spliced and the steamers began to separate, the one headed for Ireland, the other for Newfoundland, each running out the precious thread, which, it was hoped, would bind 2 continents together. Before the vessels were 3 miles apart, the cable parted. Again it was spliced, but when the ships were 80 miles apart, the current was lost. A third time the cable was spliced and about 200 miles paid out, when it parted some 20 feet from the Agamemnon, and the vessels returned to the coast of Ireland. Directors were disheartened, the public skeptical, capitalists were shy, and but for the indomitable energy and persuasiveness of Mr. Field, who worked day and night almost without food or sleep, the whole project would have been abandoned. Finally a third attempt was made, with such success that the whole cable was laid without a break, and several messages were flashed through nearly 700 leagues of ocean, when suddenly the current ceased. Faith now seemed dead except in the breast of Cyrus W. Field, and 1 or 2 friends, yet with such persistence did they work that they persuaded men to furnish capital for yet another trial even against what seemed their better judgment. A new and superior cable was loaded upon the Great Eastern, which steamed slowly out to sea, paying out as she advanced. Everything worked to a charm until within 600 miles of Newfoundland, when the cable snapped and sank. After several attempts to raise it, the enterprise was abandoned for a year. Not discouraged by all these difficulties, Mr. Field went to work with a will, organized a new company, and made a new cable far superior to anything before used, and on July 13, 1866, was begun the trial which ended with the following message sent to New York. Heart's content, July 27. We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well. Thank God. The cable is laid and is in perfect working order. Cyrus W. Field. The old cable was picked up, spliced, and continued to Newfoundland, and the two are still working, with good prospects for usefulness for many years. In Revelation we read, "He that overcometh, I will give him to sit down with me on my throne." Successful men, it is said, owe more to their perseverance than to their natural powers, their friends, or the favorable circumstances around them. Genius will falter by the side of labor, great powers will yield to great industry. Talent is desirable, but perseverance is more so. How long did it take you to learn to play? Asked a young man of Gerardini. 12 hours a day for 20 years, replied the great violinist. Lyman Beecher, when asked how long it took him to write his celebrated sermon on the government of God, replied, about 40 years. A Chinese student, discouraged by repeated failures, had thrown away his book in despair, when he saw a poor woman rubbing an iron bar on a stone to make a needle. This example of patience sent him back to his studies with a new determination, and he became one of the 3 greatest scholars of China. Malibran said, "If I neglect my practice a day, I see the difference in my execution. If for 2 days, my friends see it, and if for a week, all the world knows my failure." Constant, persistent struggle she found to be the price of her marvelous power. When an East India boy is learning archery, he is compelled to practice 3 months drawing the string to his ear before he is allowed to touch an arrow. Benjamin Franklin had this tenacity of purpose in a wonderful degree. When he started in the printing business in Philadelphia, he carried his material through the streets on a wheelbarrow. He hired one room for his office, workroom, and sleeping room. He found a formidable rival in the city and invited him to his room. Pointing to a piece of bread from which he had just eaten his dinner, he said, "Unless you can live cheaper than I can, you cannot starve me out." All are familiar with the misfortune of Carlyle while writing his history of the French Revolution. After the first volume was ready for the press, he loaned the manuscript to a neighbor who left it lying on the floor, and the servant girl took it to kindle the fire. It was a bitter disappointment, but Carlyle was not the man to give up. After many months of poring over hundreds of volumes of authorities and scores of manuscripts, he reproduced that which had burned in a few minutes. Audubon, the naturalist, had spent 2 years with his gun and notebook in the forests of America, making drawings of birds. He nailed them all up securely in a box and went off on a vacation. When he returned, he opened the box only to find a nest of Norwegian rats in his beautiful drawings. Every one was ruined. It was a terrible disappointment, but Audubon took his gun and notebook and started for the forest. He reproduced his drawings, and they were even better than the first. When Dickens was asked to read one of his selections in public, he replied that he had not time, for he was in the habit of reading the same piece every day for 6 months before reading it in public. "My own invention," he says, "such as it is, I assure you, would never have served me as it has but for the habit of commonplace, humble, patient, toiling attention." Addison amassed 3 volumes of manuscript before he began The Spectator. Everyone admires a determined, persistent man. Marcus Morton ran 16 times for governor of Massachusetts. At last his opponents voted for him from admiration of his pluck, and he was elected by a majority of 1. Such persistence always triumphs. Webster declared that when a pupil at Phillips Exeter Academy he never could declaim before the school. He said he committed piece after piece and rehearsed them in his room, but when he heard his name called in the academy and all eyes turned towards him, the room became dark and everything he ever knew fled from his brain, but he became the great orator of America. Indeed, it is doubtful whether Demosthenes himself surpassed his great reply to Hayne in the United States Senate. Webster's tenacity was illustrated by a circumstance which occurred in the academy. The principal punished him for shooting pigeons by compelling him to commit 100 lines of vigil. He knew the principal was to take a certain train that afternoon, so he went to his room and learned 700 lines. He went to recite them to the principal just before train time. After repeating the 100 lines, he continued until he had recited 200. The principal anxiously looked at his watch and grew nervous, but Webster kept right on. The principal finally stopped him and asked him how many more he had learned. "About 500 more," said Webster, continuing to recite. "You can have the rest of the day for pigeon shooting," said the principal. Great writers have ever been noted for their tenacity of purpose. Their works have not been flung off from minds aglow with genius, but have been elaborated and elaborated into grace and beauty, until every trace of their efforts has been obliterated. Bishop Butler worked 20 years incessantly on his analogy, and even then was so dissatisfied that he wanted to burn it. Rousseau says he obtained the ease and grace of his style only by ceaseless inquietude, by endless blotches and erasures. Virgil worked 11 years on the Aeneid. The notebooks of great men like Hawthorne and Emerson are telltales of the enormous drudgery, of the years put into a book which may be read in an hour. Montesquieu was 25 years writing his Esprit des Lois, yet you can read it in 60 minutes. Adam Smith spent 10 years on his Wealth of Nations. A rival playwright once laughed at Euripides for spending 3 days on 3 lines, when he had written 500 lines. "But your 500 lines in 3 days will be dead and forgotten, while my 3 lines will live forever," he replied. Ariosto wrote his description of a tempest in 16 different ways. He spent 10 years on his Orlando Furioso, and only sold 100 copies at 15 pence each. The proof of Burke's letters to a noble lord, one of the sublimest things in all literature, went back to the publisher so changed and blotted with corrections that the printer absolutely refused to correct it, and it was entirely reset. Adam Tucker spent 18 years on the Light of Nature. Thoreau's New England Pastoral, a week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, was an entire failure. 700 of the 1,000 copies printed were returned from the publishers. Thoreau wrote in his diary, "I have some 900 volumes in my library, 700 of which I wrote myself." Yet he took up his pen with as much determination as ever. The rolling stone gathers no moss. The persistent tortoise outruns the swift but fickle hare. An hour a day for 12 years more than equals the time given to study in a 4 years course at a high school. The reading and rereading of a single volume has been the making of many a man. Patience, says Bulwer, is the courage of the conqueror. It is the virtue par excellence, of man against destiny, of the one against the world, and of the soul against matter. Therefore, this is the courage of the gospel, and its importance in a social view, its importance to races and institutions, cannot be too earnestly inculcated. Want of constancy is the cause of many a failure, making the millionaire of today a beggar tomorrow. Show me a really great triumph that is not the reward of persistence. One of the paintings which made Titian famous was on his easel 8 years, another, 7. How came popular writers famous? By writing for years without any pay at all, by writing hundreds of pages as mere practice work, by working like galley slaves at literature for half a lifetime with no other compensation than fame. Never despair, says Burke, but if you do, work on in despair. The head of the god Hercules is represented as covered with a lion's skin with claws joined under the chin, to show that when we have conquered our misfortunes, they become our helpers. Oh, the glory of an unconquerable will. Chapter 24. Nerve, grip, pluck. Never give up, for the wisest is boldest, knowing that Providence mingles the cup, and of all maxims, the best, as the oldest, is the stern watchword of never give up. Be firm. One constant element of luck is genuine, solid, old Teutonic pluck. Stick to your aim. The Mongol's hold will slip, but only crowbars loose the bulldog's grip. Small though he looks, the jaw that never yields drags down the bellowing monarch of the fields. Holmes. "Soldiers, you are Frenchmen," said Napoleon, coolly walking among his disaffected generals when they threatened his life in the Egyptian campaign. "You are too many to assassinate, and too few to intimidate me." "How brave he is," exclaimed the ringleader, as he withdrew, completely cowed. "General Taylor never surrenders," said old Rough and Ready at Buena Vista, when Santa Anna with 20,000 men offered him a chance to save his 4,000 soldiers by capitulation. The battle was long and desperate, but at length the Mexicans were glad to avoid further defeat by flight. When Lincoln was asked how Grant impressed him as a general, he replied, "The greatest thing about him is cool persistency of purpose. He has the grip of a bulldog. When he once gets his teeth in, nothing can shake him off. It was on to Richmond, and I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." That settled the fate of the rebellion. "My sword is too short," said a Spartan youth to his father. "Add a step to it, then," was the only reply. It is said that the snapping turtle will not release his grip, even after his head is cut off. He is resolved, if he dies, to die hard. It is just such grit that enables men to succeed, for what is called luck is generally the prerogative of valiant souls. It is the final effort that brings victory. It is the last pull of the oar, with clenched teeth and knit muscles, that shows what Oxford boatmen call the beefiness of the fellow. After Grant's defeat at the First Battle of Shiloh, nearly every newspaper of both parties in the North, almost every member of Congress, and public sentiment everywhere demanded his removal. Friends of the president pleaded with him to give the command to someone else, for his own sake as well as for the good of the country. Lincoln listened for hours one night, speaking only at rare intervals to tell a pithy story, until the clock struck 1. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." It was Lincoln's marvelous insight and sagacity that saved Grant from the storm of popular passion, and gave us the greatest hero of the Civil War. It is this keeping right on that wins in the battle of life. Grant never looked backward. Once, after several days of hard fighting without definite result, he called a council of war. One general described the route by which he would retreat, another thought it better to retire by a different road, and general after general told how he would withdraw, or fall back, or seek a more favorable position in the rear. At length all eyes were turned upon Grant, who had been a silent listener for hours. He rose, took a bundle of papers from an inside pocket, handed one to each general, and said, "Gentlemen, at dawn you will execute those orders." Every paper gave definite directions for an advance, and with the morning sun the army moved forward to victory. Massina's army of 18,000 men in Genoa had been reduced by fighting and famine to 8,000. They had killed and captured more than 15,000 Austrians, but their provisions were completely exhausted, starvation stared them in the face, the enemy outnumbered them 4-1, and they seemed at the mercy of their opponents. General Ott demanded a discretionary surrender, but Marsena replied, "My soldiers must be allowed to march out with colors flying, and arms and baggage, not as prisoners of war, but free to fight when and where we please. If you do not grant this, I will sally forth from Genoa sword in hand. With 8,000 famished men I will attack your camp, and I will fight till I cut my way through it." Ott knew the temper of the great soldier, and agreed to accept the terms if he would surrender himself, or if he would depart by sea so as not to be quickly joined by reinforcements. Massina's only reply was, "Take my terms, or I will cut my way through your army." Ott at last agreed, when Marsena said, "I give you notice that ere 15 days are past I shall be once more in Genoa," and he kept his word. Napoleon said of this man, who was orphaned in infancy and cast upon the world to make his own way in life, when defeated, Marsena was always ready to fight a battle over again, as though he had been the conqueror. "The battle is completely lost," said Desaix, looking at his watch, when consulted by Napoleon at Marengo, "but it is only 2 o'clock, and we shall have time to gain another." He then made his famous cavalry charge, and won the field, although a few minutes before the French soldiers all along the line were momentarily expecting an order to retreat. "Well," said Barnum to a friend in 1841, "I am going to buy the American Museum." "Buy it?" exclaimed the astonished friend, who knew that the showman had not a dollar. "What do you intend buying it with?" "Brass," was the prompt reply, "for silver and gold have I none." Everyone interested in public entertainments in New York knew Barnum, and knew the condition of his pocket, but Francis Olmsted, who owned the museum building, consulted numerous references all telling of a good showman, who would do as he agreed, and accepted a proposition to give security for the purchaser. Mr. Olmsted was to appoint a money-taker at the door, and credit Barnum towards the purchase with all above expenses and an allowance of $50 per month to support his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Barnum assented to the arrangement, and offered to cut down the household expenses to a little more than $1 a day. 6 months later Mr. Olmsted entered the ticket office at noon, and found Barnum eating for dinner a few slices of bread and some corned beef. "Is this the way you eat your dinner?" he asked. "I have not eaten a warm dinner since I bought the museum, except on the Sabbath, and I intend never to eat another until I get out of debt." "Ah, you are safe, and will pay for the museum before the year is out," said Mr. Olmsted, slapping the young man approvingly on the shoulder. He was right, for in less than a year Barnum had paid every cent out of the profits of the establishment. "Hard pounding, gentlemen," said Wellington at Waterloo to his officers, "but we will see who can pound the longest." "It is very kind of them to send our letters for us," said young Junot coolly, as an Austrian shell scattered earth over the dispatch he was writing at the dictation of his commander-in-chief. The remark attracted Napoleon's attention and led to the promotion of the scrivener. "There is room enough up higher," said Webster to a young man hesitating to study law because the profession was so crowded. This is true in every department of activity. The young man who succeeds must hold his ground and push hard. Whoever attempts to pass through the door to success will find it labeled, push. There is another big word in the English language. The perfection of grit is the power of saying no, with emphasis that cannot be mistaken. Learn to meet hard times with a harder will, and more determined pluck. The nature which is all pine and straw is of no use in times of trial. We must have some oak and iron in us. The goddess of fame or of fortune has been won by many a poor boy who had no friends, no backing, or anything but pure grit and invincible purpose. A good character, good habits, and iron industry are impregnable to the assaults of the ill luck that fools are dreaming of. There is no luck, for all practical purposes, to him who is not striving, and whose senses are not all eagerly attent. What are called accidental discoveries are almost invariably made by those who are looking for something. A man incurs about as much risk of being struck by lightning as by accidental luck. There is, perhaps, an element of luck in the amount of success which crowns the efforts of different men, but even here it will usually be found that the sagacity with which the efforts are directed and the energy with which they are prosecuted measure pretty accurately the luck contained in the results achieved. Apparent exceptions will be found to relate almost wholly to single undertakings, while in the long run the rule will hold good. 2 pearl divers, equally expert, dive together and work with equal energy. One brings up a pearl, while the other returns empty-handed. But let both persevere, and at the end of 5, 10, or 20 years it will be found that they succeeded almost in exact proportion to their skill and industry. Varied experience of men has led me, the longer I live, says Huxley, to set less value on mere cleverness, to attach more and more importance to industry and physical endurance. Indeed, I am much disposed to think that endurance is the most valuable quality of all, for industry, as the desire to work hard, does not come to much if a feeble frame is unable to respond to the desire. No life is wasted unless it ends in sloth, dishonesty, or cowardice. No success is worthy of the name unless it is won by honest industry and brave breasting of the waves of fortune. Has luck ever made a fool speak words of wisdom, an ignoramus utter lectures on science, a dolt write an Odyssey, an Aeneid, a Paradise Lost, or a Hamlet, a loafer become a Girard or Astor, a Rothschild, Stuart, Vanderbilt, Field, Gould, or Rockefeller, a coward win at Yorktown, Wagram, Waterloo, or Richmond. A careless stonecutter carve an Apollo, a Minerva, a Venus de Medici, or a Greek slave. Does luck raise rich crops on the land of the sluggard, weeds and brambles on that of the industrious farmer? Does luck make the drunkard sleek and attractive, and his home cheerful, while the temperate man looks haggard and suffers want and misery? Does luck starve honest labor, and pamper idleness? Does luck put common sense at a discount, folly at a premium? Does it cast intelligence into the gutter, and raise ignorance to the skies? Does it imprison virtue, and laud vice? Did luck give Watt his engine, Franklin his captive lightning, Whitney his cotton gin, Fulton his steamboat, Morse his telegraph, Blanchard his lathe, Howe his sewing machine, Goodyear his rubber, Bell his telephone, Edison his phonograph? If you are told of the man who, worn out by a painful disorder, tried to commit suicide, but only opened an internal tumor, effecting a cure, of the Persian condemned to lose his tongue, on whom a bungling operation merely removed an impediment of speech, of a painter who produced an effect long desired by throwing his brush at a picture in rage and despair, of a musician who, after repeated failures in trying to imitate a storm at sea, obtained the result desired by angrily running his hands together from the extremities of the keyboard, bear in mind that even this luck came to men as the result of action, not inaction. Luck is ever waiting for something to turn up, says Cobden. Labor, with keen eyes and strong will turn up something. Luck lies in bed, and wishes the postman would bring him the news of a legacy. Labor turns out at 6 o'clock, and with busy pen or ringing hammer lays the foundation of a competence. Luck whines, labor whistles. Luck relies on chance, labor, on character. Stick to the thing and carry it through. Believe you were made for the place you fill, and that no one else can fill it as well. Put forth your whole energies. Be awake, electrify yourself, go forth to the task. Only once learn to carry a thing through in all its completeness and proportion, and you will become a hero. You will think better of yourself, others will think better of you. The world in its very heart admires the stern, determined door. I like the man who faces what he must with step triumphant and a heart of cheer, who fights the daily battle without fear, sees his hopes fail, yet keeps unfaltering trust that God is God, that somehow, true and just, his plans work out for mortals. Not a tear is shed when fortune, which the world holds dear, falls from his grasp. Better, with love, a crust than living in dishonor, envies not, nor loses faith in man, but does his best, nor even murmurs at his humble lot, but with a smile and words of hope, gives zest to every toiler. He alone is great, who by a life heroic conquers fate.